Alrighty. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to come and join your Delegates Conference here today. Thank you very much to Grant and Tom and Thurza and Karen for having me. I can already sense the energy and the power in the room, and I know that you're going to do great things at this conference, but even more so, as Tom said, you're the backbone of our movement, and you're doing great things every day. Now, amidst all this energy and hope, what did the planners of the conference do? First thing in the morning, they brought on the Economist. Just when you thought it was safe to be optimistic about the world, along comes the Economist. Sounds kind of like a Stephen King novel, doesn't it? Actually, they do say an economist is someone who's good with numbers, but didn't have the personality to become an accountant. Which is why, Tom, you should never put the Economist on first thing in the morning, but you shouldn't put them on after lunch either. So I'm actually not sure when the hell you should put them on. We'll try to keep you awake anyways as we go through some of the material. I have to have one little paid advertisement. If I could. One paid advertisement for a new clicker. A new battery in the clicker, perhaps.
On the side it isn't off.
Oh, turn it on. No, it was on. Yeah, it was on. We're still getting the first screen, Will, so I don't know if we're actually projecting the...
Seamless. I promise it was. We'll be all day of working with he was the most techy out of the so he got the job.
Okay, beauty. Now we're Thank you. Okay, so one quick word from the paid advertisement for the Centre for Future Work. That's my organization, which is part of the Australia Institute, Australia's major progressive think tank. And we were started a year and a bit ago to be a centre of expertise, arm's length from the union movement, but firmly allied with the union movement in terms of generating the arguments, the facts and figures, the ammunition, if you like, in a peaceful way for the work that you folks do. And all of our work's available open access on our website there. I invite you to join us on social media as well. There's my handle, Jimbo Stanford, and the organization's handle. You're welcome to tweet during this presentation as well. And look forward to working with you. So Thurza gave me a very modest list of small topics to cover in my 30 minutes here: the future work, the value of public services, and equity, gender, and fairness. If we've got time, I'll teach you how to install your home theater system and bake an excellent quiche at the end of it. So I better jump right in, given the scope of what we're going to cover. So there's no doubt that Australia's labour market is upside down. The contradictions and irrationalities that we see around us in the world of work today are, in a way, what makes us so furious when we've read the morning newspaper that we go right out and work to build our union. Look at the contradictions that are visible. Workers in Australia are producing more with each hour of labour than they ever have. So value added per hour of labour keeps rising year after year, thanks to efficiencies, thanks to machinery, thanks to technology, thanks to our skills. Up 60% in the last generation. And I'm still amazed that all the coalition politicians and others stand up and say, you know, those things we used to take advantage of in the past, well, we just can't afford them anymore. They're just not fiscally sustainable. Well, guess what? We produce 60% more value with every hour of labor than we did a generation ago. So anything we could afford back in the 70s or 80s, we can afford today. And by the way, 60% more. Okay, so let's cut to the chase on that one. Workers are producing more, but they're getting paid less as a share of what they produce. Real wages right now in Australia aren't growing at all. In fact, they're shrinking a bit, and they have lagged well behind labour productivity for many years. That means that labour's share of the pie, that labour, after all, bakes, okay, it is work that is the source of the value added in the economy. Our share has been shrinking since the late 1970s. And in fact, our research showed that as of March of this year, it hit a record low 46% of GDP going to workers in wages, salaries, superannuation contributions, the lowest since ABS began collecting the data. So there's an irrationality. Okay, we're told we have to work for our money, well, we're working more but getting less. For the business community, on the other hand, the logic is reversed. The business community is doing less. This graph shows the real investment, okay, that businesses in Australia make in capital of all kinds. Okay, it could be structures, factories, offices, shopping malls, bank towers. It can be machinery, computers, robots, assembly lines. It can be technology, innovation, research. Everything they spend on investment, which is supposed to be their role in the economy, has been shrinking steadily for the last 5 years. Almost perfectly corresponding, by the way, with the election of this business-friendly government in Canberra. Okay, so if this is how business does with a business-friendly government, that suggests to me we should elect a government that's going to kick business in the ass and say, get out and actually do something. But while they do less, they're getting paid more. So the corporate share of the pie has been growing. In fact, that decline in the labor share that I showed you, 11 percentage points shifted away from labor since the late 70s. 10 of those 11 percentage points, so almost all of it, has ended up in the form of higher corporate profits, including in the last year alone. Corporate profits up 30% year on year. Total payments of wages, salary, and super in Australia's economy up by 1.5% in the same time, not even keeping up with inflation. So we do more and get paid less. They do less and get paid more. The way I seem to think of it is that the corporate sector in Australia has, in a way, I don't want to sound like I'm blaming them, okay? I think they've become locked in an unfortunate cycle of dependence, okay? The more tax cuts and favors and concessions we give them, the less work they actually do, which suggests the need for a change. Another way of showing the same trend is to look at how income is being distributed in the economy. We've seen a dramatic rebound in the share of income taken by the richest segments of society. These are the people who are doing well and who own the biggest slice of the business wealth that has been rewarded. So the share of the richest in the income of Australia declined steadily during the post-war era through the 50s and 60s and 70s. Okay, as we were implementing policies like strong unions, strong collective agreements, strong awards, strong national employment standards, we were doing the things that are required to share the wealth. Their share of the income fell, and I mean, it's no wonder they were outraged. Look, they're the richest 1% of society, and by the 80s, they were only getting 4 or 5% of national income. They're only getting 4 or 5 times their fair share, and that's just completely unacceptable. So they turned things around with policies that have been deliberately aimed at restricting labor compensation, boosting profits, and then enhancing the income of those who own the biggest shares. Now, Scott Morrison is the only person in the world who could look at this graph and say, income inequality is not growing in Australia. I think he must be comparing that point to that point. I don't know how he got the idea. Of course, he's lying through his teeth on that score. Income inequality has grown dramatically in Australia. It is no longer the land of the fair go, which we once hoped that it was. Another contradiction, we're seeing all kinds of improvements in technology and productivity and efficiency and robots, yet the quality of work tends to get degraded. Okay, instead of enhancing our work and investing in our skills and treating labor as a valuable input, okay, they're treating it as a just-in-time disposable service in essence, and they're finding all kinds of ways to invent menial, unproductive, and obviously poorly paid jobs, even as our work holds such potential to produce value added. Another dimension of the contradiction, we've got Scott Morrison. He's a kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character. On the one hand, he loves the idea of the economy paying out higher wages, especially when he's bringing down his annual budget, because if we're making more money, that means we're paying more taxes, that means he can balance the budget. So that's exactly the forecast that he put in the latest Commonwealth budget, where he says the budget's going to be balanced in 4 years. This, by the way, is the 4th consecutive Commonwealth budget that has pledged to balance the budget in 4 years, okay? So we're kind of in a Groundhog Day type scenario here. By the 4th year, he's seeing total wages and salaries growing at 5.25% a year compared to 1.5% today, which is magnificent when you're tabling your budget. He must have put the CFMEU in charge of the national economy, I guess. But at any rate, it's fiction, okay? Because in reality, we've got a Mr. Hyde on our hands, a grumpy-faced Mr. Hyde, and he doesn't actually want higher wages, even though he says he does, because his plan consists of cutting penalty rates, keeping the minimum wage below the poverty line, freezing the wages of public servants, in some cases just by refusing to negotiate with them for years at a time, this ongoing holy crusade against unions. Every now and then he'll come out and ask politely for business to pay the workers more. He did this a couple of weeks ago, and it was kind of humorous and pathetic at the same time. He said, I think business profits have grown enough. I think it's about time you start paying higher wages. But if anyone actually won higher wages, because of course you can't just ask for them, you have to win them, then he complains loudly about it. Here in Tasmania, of course, you have your golden boy premier, who has his own plan for raising wages in Tasmania. It's a 4-point plan. First point, cap the wages of public servants. Point number 2, cap the wages of public servants, followed by point 3 and point 4. So it is incredibly ironic. You've got all these government officials now wringing their hands about wage stagnation and the fact that wages aren't growing, and at least recognizing that wages are economically valuable, right? As opposed to describing wage increases as evil incarnate. Yet, they are not acknowledging remotely their own responsibility, including direct intervention in the labor market to suppress wages in the public sector for what they have done. This is the greatest sign that the world, as we know it, has ended. The governor of the central bank, looks like he's on amphetamines in this picture, Philip Lowe, said workers need to go out and demand more money. Again, recognizing that wage stagnation is hurting the economy. But he likewise doesn't acknowledge anything about the shift in bargaining power and the erosion of the institutions that once supported wages. He almost blames the victim and said workers are too scared about machinery and globalization. Stop being so scared, people. Go out and ask for more. Almost like you're in the movie Oliver, you know, when you're going to hold up the bowl, please can I have some more, and that's all you have to do. In reality, you have to have power to win wages, which is what this room is all about. So it's a sure sign that pigs are flying in Australia's labor market. The diagnosis of this upside-down labor market, we have a situation where the labor market is underperforming badly on both quantity grounds and quality grounds. Employers, including in the public sector, are taking advantage of the desperation and insecurity of working people to extract more work for less pay in all kinds of ways, including offering very insecure, non-standard, precarious jobs. And government is, instead of pushing against this trend in the interests of a more equal and healthy economy, government is facilitating. So let's look at those two dimensions quickly. The quantity problem first. There isn't enough work to go around. We see that in the official data on unemployment statistics. Excuse me, over 700,000 Australians officially unemployed, but that really is just the tip of the iceberg. And the unemployment data doesn't remotely begin to describe how weak the labor market is. Under the surface, you've got over 1 million Australians who are underemployed. That means they want to work more. They could work as little as 1 hour in the reference week, and then you show up in the ABS data as employed. Okay, how handy is that for the politicians, right? It gets you off the unemployment rolls, but the reality is you're still effectively unemployed except for that 1 hour. There's at least 400,000 Australians who've abandoned the labor force because there isn't work out there. They say over 1 million Australians are quote-unquote marginally attached, which means they want to work, but they're not seeking work to the satisfaction of the ABS rules, which says you have to be putting in several applications a week in order to show up as a job seeker. If you're just sitting there looking at ads and so on, it doesn't count. So put it all together, you've got about 3 million Australians, by my reckoning, that are unemployed or underutilized. And think about it, the official unemployment rate is 5.6%. Does it feel like a 5.6% world out there? No, not remotely. Talk about young people trying to find a job, talk about displaced or restructured workers trying to find a job, talk about the desperation of trying to hang on to a job. Our estimate is the true unemployment rate is closer to 15%, not 5%, and I think that is fitting with how it feels out there. On the quality side, even when jobs are created, they are not they're not adequate to provide for the stable maintenance of households. In other words, they are what we in economics call shitty jobs. Okay? Shitty job is a technical term. I should define terms as we go along, Tom. It means employment position inadequate to meet the basics of life. Okay? So we're getting a lot of insecure, precarious, contingent work. Think of it as a just-in-time input to production. The employer hires you just when you need it and then tosses you aside when you're not. And we see this in all kinds of forms like irregular schedules, the growth of part-time work, the misuse of independent contractor status to avoid employment responsibilities, and so on. And by our research, over half of Australian workers today experience one or more of those dimensions of insecure work. The proportion of Australian workers who have what was traditionally considered a standard job, permanent, paid, full-time, year-round, with entitlements, is about 46% of the labor force now. So it's not just that it feels like it's hard to get one of those jobs, it really is. Now we've got this whole debate about the future of work where people are saying robots and digital platforms are going to eliminate traditional employment. And this is where we've got to put our, sort of turn on our bullshit detectors, if you like, and think through some of the hype that's out there. For example, when we talk about digital platforms, you know, whether it's Uber or Airtasker or any of those other new business models, we're seeing the use of new technology, obviously, internet-based, to connect people, to connect workers with customers, or to connect workers with jobs. So the matching and scheduling and so on that goes on is obviously using something new, a smartphone, okay? But is the practice itself really new? I mean, let's think about it. What is a gig job? It's one where you don't have regular hours, you're on call, you get paid only when you're needed to do the work. You often have to work on your own premises or in your own car, supplying your own tools, right? And you're paid on a piece-by-piece basis. You're not paid an hourly or weekly payment, you're paid according to each job. Well, guess what, folks? There's nothing new about that at all. In fact, every one of those practices of this so-called new innovative labor market have been around for hundreds of years, really, since the dawn of capitalism. For example, think of the old putting out system, is what it was called in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. The first manufacturing businesses consisted of a merchant who owned the raw materials, think of textiles, say, farmed out the raw materials to people, often women, who took the materials home, worked on it using their own machinery, you know, their sewing machines and cutters and all that, assembled or processed it, then brought the product back to the merchant to get paid, and then hoped for another gig. Okay, that was called the putting out system, or sometimes called the cottage system. So the only thing missing here is a smartphone. Okay, so I'll put a smartphone in her hand there. Okay, and now we've got the latest digital gig platform. It's called puttingout.com. Okay, so nothing new there except for the method for organizing and compensating the work, but nothing new in terms of actual how the work is itself done. Same is true of piecework systems, where you're paid for each piece of work. They have a long history from managers who see this as an easy way to solve the management problem. Instead of looking over someone's shoulder to see if they're working, we'll just pay them by the piece. And in some cases that's effective from management's point of view. In most cases it's not. Most jobs in our society today involve judgment, quality rather than quantity, working in teams, all of things that are hard to apply piecework systems to. But there's nothing new about the idea. Same goes for on-call work, being available to do a job when you're needed. This is Sydney's Hungry Mile, when hundreds of longshore workers used to go down to the docks every morning and hope that they'd get tapped on the shoulder for a job. And if they didn't, then tough luck, go home and try again tomorrow. There's the so-called gig economy. So I think we have to be a bit skeptical of all of the hype that, number one, this new technology of work is really that new. Number two, that it's somehow going to put us all out of work and somehow make workers dispensable. In fact, I would argue workers are indispensable to the production of value added in the working of our economy. Technology is not neutral, first of all. We have apps that follow workers around. You've seen this in many of your workplaces on a moment-to-moment basis, providing the employer with real-time information about where you are and how long you spent in the toilet, right? We do not have an app that can determine whether a 7-Eleven store is paying the minimum wage or not, okay? I say we need an app to determine whether they're paying the minimum wage, but that shows you the power relationships that are embedded in the way that technology has evolved, and especially the way technology is implemented. So I think we have to critique this idea of technological determinism, somehow this idea that our fate is just being determined by scientists and engineers. It isn't. Our fate depends on social choices that we make in Australia about how work is organized, how workers are treated, and how work is compensated. And none of that is determined by technology. That's all determined by social dialogue, social debate, and power. So we are not yet in the world of Terminator, I'm glad to say. For those of you who even know what Terminator is, Tom, I see you've got a pretty young crowd of delegates, which is an awesome thing, and so half of this room probably doesn't even know what the fuck I'm talking about. Terminator was this movie, 80s, classic. Actually, they say it's a chick flick disguised as a guy flick, because it's all about emotions and loyalty, dressed up with action and death and all that. Anyway, we are not yet in the realm of Terminator. The machines don't control us. People still control the machines. The question is, which people are controlling the machines and what are the machines being used for? I do not think work will ever disappear. Work is a driving force. It is the engine of the economy. Okay? Even with robots, employers still need workers, including to design, develop, engineer, manufacture, operate, and maintain the robots, let alone the new jobs that we think of because the robots are there. And at the same time as that's happening, you've got that thing that I showed you earlier about the guy being paid minimum wage to hold a sign, where this labor market of ours, this race to the bottom, will find useless, idiotic things to do that are still profitable. Okay? Anytime I see somebody working, standing on a street corner holding a sign, and you see that a lot, that's sheer proof the minimum wage is far too low. Okay? That companies can afford to just hire someone to stand there with a sign. That's got to be the most unproductive thing you can imagine. By the way, employers need us to be making money so we can buy what they produce. I remember when Henry Ford, who invented the assembly line, took a union leader around the new factory and said, look, see all these machines? They never go on strike. And the union leader said to Henry Ford, and guess what? They don't buy your cars either, okay? So we have to have work and workers and compensation in order to keep the system running. They also need our acceptance of the system. No matter how flawed our democracy is, and it is highly flawed, the system cannot function if most people are calling it for what it is, which is a bit of an exploitive rort, okay, where a few people at the top are capturing all the gains. We have to support ourselves as workers, and the vast majority of us can only do that by working. The number of people who've got enough accumulated business wealth to actually just live off their wealth without working is about 2% of the Australian society. And even if you've got a decent super account and you figure you play the markets better than most people, the reality is you still have to get your butt out of bed on Monday morning and go and do a job. So the nature and quality of work may change and is under pressure for all kinds of reasons, and technology is part of that. But it is not ultimately a technological story, it's a social story. And the system needs us. The system needs our labor, our effort, including labor in the public sector, or it stops. And we should remember that. We shouldn't forget it, and we can't let them forget it. So the solution to that twin problem in our labor market, the problem of quantity and quality, is also a twin solution. We need more jobs, and we need better jobs. We need governments that are committed to full employment and job creation as their top priority rather than budget cutting and austerity. And then we need a whole set of rules and institutions that will improve the quality of work and ensure that the wealth that's being created is shared better than it is right now. And you're going to hear from Sally this afternoon on the Change of the Rules campaign, which is what that's all about. Let me say a little bit about public services work and how that fits into our economic analysis and our understanding the future of work. Contrary to what you read in the Murdoch press, public services are not just a way to throw trillions of dollars down a black hole. Okay, public services are not a cost item to be minimized. The reality is, if the economy depends on work producing value added, that absolutely includes the work of public sector workers producing value added in the form of essential human, public, and caring services. 100%, we've got economics on our side on this one. No doubt public sector work creates jobs, it creates value added, it generates income, it generates taxes for the governments that supply it. The consumption of the services that you and your members produce adds directly to the quality of life. Okay, we cannot just live on shopping alone, okay? Our lives require safety, care, education, healthcare, entertainment, and good communities to live in. And all of that requires public services. The reality is, this is interesting, public service jobs, according to most of these studies, are somewhat less likely to be automated or replaced by robots than many other jobs in the private sector, precisely because the nature of your work in providing those services often requires directly an inherent hands-on component that cannot be automated. So we have to, as a society, stop seeing public services as a cost or a drain. We have to start seeing it for what it is, as a leader, an engine of growth, and economic opportunity. So here's the increase in employment of major sectors in Australia's economy over the last 5 years. And interesting that 3 of the top 6 sectors, okay, the health and social services sector, public administration, and education, are all public sector leaders. So where are jobs coming from? They are disproportionately coming from the public sector. Not because there's spend crazy governments and they're just throwing money around. Far from it. In fact, in most cases, we've had to fight to win these increases in public sector employment against the knee-jerk austerity desires of conservative government. Going forward, it's exactly the same. The latest Department of Employment forecast of job creation suggests that about half of all new jobs created in Australia in the next 5 years are going to be in the public and human services area. So close to 500,000 out of the 1 million jobs that are expected to be created over the next 5 years. So if the mining industry was creating one-tenth this many jobs, it would be trumpeted on the front page of the Oz as a magnificent economic success story. And here you have the public sector quietly creating 10 times that much new work, and yet it's still treated as some kind of drain. Lots of ways that public sector work benefits the overall economy. You get tens of thousands of direct jobs, of course, as governments increase their fiscal support for public services. And the reality is that public sector work is relatively labor intensive. So you get more bang for the buck from every $1 billion that's spent on public services in terms of new jobs created than you would in an industry like mining or construction, where a lot of the money has to be spent on inputs and machinery and so on. So you're getting a very strong direct effect, but you also get strong indirect or spin-off effects, both because the public sector services themselves buy a lot of stuff, a lot of inputs, a lot of raw materials, a lot of services from private sector companies. That's what we call the upstream effect. Also, the downstream effect is important in the sense that once people are employed in the public service, that income is going to stimulate further purchasing power in the economy. Because I know your CPSU members are very good at 2 things. They're very good at doing their job, providing public services and earning income. Okay, that's the first thing they're really good at. What's the second thing CPSU members are really good at? Spending that income as soon as they get it. And in fact, thanks to the magic of credit, you don't even have to wait to get it before you spend it. Okay? So the reality is, what goes around comes around, and the money that's injected, the incomes that are created by providing public services end up supporting the economy as well. All kinds of other important spin-off benefits from public services for the economy. A really important one is if you're providing public and caring services to people who need them, you're enabling their greater participation in the society and the economy, so that if you're providing accessible quality childcare, you're enabling more labor force participation in employment and production by mothers. If you're providing excellent disability services, you're enabling more participation in society, including work by people with disabilities and so on. Let's trace through some of the links of how all of these benefits of public sector work are experienced. Let's choose a nominal public sector caring service that's happening there. And there's the worker and the children that they're caring for in whatever setting. It's a child care or school or some kind of community service. The worker gets money, and what happens to about 25 or 30% of their money? Paid straight to the government in taxes, okay? Then, with their after-tax money, what do as soon as they finish their work? They go to Target or H&M or Kohl's and spend it, okay? They spend that money as soon as they get it, and they're paying 10% GST on all the money that they spent. Plus, the business that they've catered to with their spending also has to pay taxes based on their income. Then don't forget the upstream side of it. The operation of the public sector service itself requires inputs that are purchased from other companies in the private sector, and they pay taxes. So all told, when you add up the stimulus effect of public sector spending, there's what's called a multiplier effect, a GDP multiplier effect, which means the final impact on Australia's total economy is bigger than this amount that was spent on the public service in the first place. Okay, so if you spend $1 billion on a new public service, you're going to get more than $1 billion in final increased output in the economy. And the reality is, government in Australia takes about a third of each dollar in GDP in the form of all of the different taxes that are collected. Income taxes, GST, land taxes, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, government is going to get back at least 35 cents in direct flowback revenue for every dollar that they spend on public sector provision. But this is where this whole knee-jerk austerity situation that we've experienced in Australia over recent years, and I know you're fighting here in Tasmania, is such a case of shooting yourself in the foot. The government says we're saving money by squeezing it out of you and your members through intrusion in normal collective bargaining and downsizing and cutbacks and wage restraint. But the reality is there's all kinds of unintended consequences from that austerity that end up being very negative. First of all, it's not just public sector workers who feel the pinch every time the government comes in and says we're putting a cap on wages. The reality is private sector employers look at that and say, yeah, they're putting a cap on wages. I'm going to put a cap on wages too. Especially any private sector company that's supplying the government. That's the first thing they do. But any other private sector employers are also. It's a signal that is sent to the whole labor market that wages are too high and have to be controlled. And that's exactly what we see. We see private sector wages trending down in tandem with the public sector restraint. You get reduced consumer spending, reduced GDP, reduced tax revenues, all kinds of other unintended consequences. We did a big study a couple of weeks ago on superannuation and how superannuation accumulation was being undermined by wage restraint, including pay freezes and pay caps in the public sector. So hashtag DA on this one for all the bright minds running these budget-cutting governments. It is actually not the way that you develop your economy and grow your economy. A little bit about the equality benefits of public sector provision, getting to the third point on the to-do list that Thursday gave me with this presentation. The reality is public sector and public services are a crucial way, a crucial conduit for us to share the wealth in society and care for each other and lift all of our standards of living. And it means that if you think of taxes as the price of civilized society and the public services that are paid for with taxes as a crucial complement to our quality of life, then we have a much more equal society with taxes and public services than without. And this is, I think, one of the more striking ways to look at it. We can measure inequality in our society in kind of three distinct stages. The first stage is where we're looking at the gross market incomes that people receive from their jobs, from their investments, from their small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And in that regard, if we're measuring the top fifth of society to the bottom fifth of society, we live in a 12-to-1 world measured by gross income. And I'm comparing the top fifth to the bottom fifth, so this is not the most dramatic way to look at inequality. If I had the data, I'd show you the top 1% compared to the bottom 1%. That would be astronomical. The graph wouldn't fit on the screen. Then you have the role of direct income redistributions through the tax and transfer system. The government comes and collects some of the money from taxes, and despite its flaws, our tax system is still progressive. And then it gives out some of the money in the form of income supports, such as age pension, New Start, child allowance, and so on. When we include that, the amount of income at the top shrinks, the amount of income at the bottom grows a bit, and we end up in a 6-to-1 world rather than a 12-to-1 world. So just the pure redistribution impact of government has had a huge impact. But it gets better still, because then government uses those taxes to pay for the provision of public services that supplement the living standards of both rich and poor Australians. But the relative increase in living standards from public services is more important for poor people, and we end up in a 3-to-1 world. So the role of public services and the taxes that are collected to pay for public services is essential in trying to keep a lid on the growing inequality that we see. Another dimension of this that's really important, and I know the public sector is very much focused on, is the gender dimension of inequality. And this again is where public sector activity and public services is absolutely crucial. Both the delivery of the public services themselves are crucial to improving gender equality and enhancing the opportunity of women for full participation in life, including the workforce. When public services are cut, it is inevitably women that end up picking up the lion's share of the burden. And in the actual provision of public sector services and the jobs that go with it, the public sector is incredibly important as a source of high-quality jobs for women and as a place where the goals of gender equality in the workplace can be advanced, largely because of the efforts of your union and others. So the public sector is way ahead of the private sector in terms of promoting gender equality. And that's crucial because I think the problem of gender inequality in the labor market is much worse than we typically are told. We're sometimes told there's a pay gap still of 16 or 17%. That's a bit of an artificial measure by my reading because it's comparing full-time permanent paid employment for men to full-time permanent paid employment for women. But the problem is that women are much less likely to be in full-time paid permanent employment in the first place, and that's part of the problem. If we just look at how much men and women make, the pay gap is much bigger, in the order of 33%. So let me wrap up. I thank you for your attention. I didn't see anybody except a couple who fell asleep during the morning Economist and all the charts and graphs and mind-numbing data. The reality is that your members are the people who produce public services that are absolutely a crucial, legitimate, valuable source of economic growth and economic opportunity. And society is going to need more of what your people do in the future, not less. And valuing this work, treating the people who perform the work fairly, and strengthening our capacity as a society to pay for that work on an ongoing basis is going to be absolutely crucial to building a better Australia in the future. So what you folks are doing is benefiting everyone, and I thank you very much for doing it. Thank you for listening.